There's a silent moment in life that doesn't come with warning, only with weight. You feel it not in your thoughts, but in your bones. It's the sudden sense that the life you've been living no longer belongs to you. The titles you carried, the roles you played, the habits you repeated, they start to fall apart, not because they were wrong, but because they were temporary. And you begin to realize something profound. You were not born to maintain an identity. You were born to transcend it. Carl Jung called this moment the second half of life, not in terms of age, but in terms of awakening. It's when the persona, the mask you created to survive, to belong, to succeed, begins to crumble. And behind it, something older, something sacred, and starts to rise. This is not a crisis, it's a calling. But most people fear it, because it feels like death. And in a way, it is. It's the death of pretending, the death of proving, the death of performing a version of yourself just to be loved. In that silence after the collapse, there's an emptiness that feels unbearable. But it's not the end, it's the soil. Because what dies in that silence makes space for your soul. And your soul is not here to continue. It's here to resurrect. Carl Jung understood something most psychologists still fear to say, that the human being is not fulfilled by adaptation, but by individuation. In the first half of life, we are trained to adapt, to culture, to family, to expectations. We build a persona. We become what is needed, admired, or accepted. We shape ourselves to fit the world. But in the second half, the soul begins to shape the world from within us, and the same identity that once protected us begins to imprison us. We feel stuck, anxious, restless. But it's not a failure. It's the psyche demanding truth. Jung said that what you did in the morning of your life becomes useless in the afternoon, not because it was wrong, but because it was for another season. Just as the leaves fall in autumn to prepare the tree for winter, so too must our constructed self fall, so the deeper self can emerge. This is the stage of life where individuation begins. Not to become someone else, but to become who you already were, underneath the masks. Individuation is not achievement, it's return. It is the path of subtraction, not addition. You don't gain a new self, you shed the false one, and as you do, the soul begins to breathe again. At some point, words stop working. The advice of others sounds hollow. Books offer reflections, but not answers. And even prayer feels like silence echoing back to you. This is not abandonment. It is initiation. You are not being punished. You are being emptied. Because the true self cannot enter a space already full of noise, roles, and obligations. The persona must be set down, gently, or by force, so the soul can rise without opposition. Jung spoke of the danger of remaining stuck in the first half of life, clinging to an identity long past its function. He called it a spiritual emergency, because the psyche, if unheard, begins to whisper through symptoms: fatigue, anxiety, apathy, disorientation, depression without cause. But they're not the disease, and they are the signals. The symptoms are the sacred messengers of the self. And when you withdraw, not to escape but to observe, something begins to shift. You notice how much of your life was lived for others, how often you silenced your truth to avoid conflict, how the inner child never stopped waiting for you. This stage is a descent, not into despair, but into depth. And if you dare to go fully in, you find something astonishing. You were never lost, you were only buried. Throughout Scripture, the pattern of death and resurrection is never about biology, it's about becoming. Moses was not called until after 40 years of wilderness. Paul met the divine not in a temple, but through blindness on the road. Jesus spent 30 hidden years before 3 years of truth. The Bible speaks a language deeper than law. It speaks the language of transformation, and transformation always begins in loss. loss of certainty, loss of control, loss of self as you knew it. But in that emptiness, God begins to write something new, not on stone tablets, but on the silence of your soul. The second half of life is the fulfillment of what was promised in the first, but only if we are willing to let go of what no longer serves. And this letting go is not passive. It is sacred. It is choosing to surrender the life you built for the life you were born to live, to die to the persona so the presence can live, to silence the roles so the real voice can speak, to release the illusion of self so the true self, the imago Dei within you, can emerge, not in noise, but in stillness. Resurrection does not begin in the spotlight, it begins in the shadows, where no one sees, no one applauds, and no one understands what you're becoming. It begins with one decision: to stop betraying yourself. The second half of life isn't about adding more, it's about shedding what was never yours to carry. You no longer chase validation. You no longer perform a role. You no longer force yourself to fit where you no longer belong. Instead, you become. Jung called this the process of individuation, the sacred unfolding of the self as it was always meant to be. Not the self your parents hoped for, not the self society applauded, but the self God whispered into being before time began. This is not a quick awakening, it is a silent return, and every time you listen instead of speak, observe instead of react, rest instead of strive, the resurrection continues. You stop clinging to how it was. You stop fearing how it will be. And you finally start living as you are. There is no applause for this inner rebirth, but there is peace. And that peace is the presence of your soul, no longer hiding, no longer afraid, no longer divided. The world will not understand what you're doing. They will ask why you changed, why you withdrew, why you stopped explaining, why you don't chase the same things anymore. But you will know. You didn't retreat. You resurrected. You didn't give up. You gave in to what truly matters. The second half of life is not an echo of the first. It is a return to origin, a deeper birth from within. And if it feels like nothing is happening, it's because the most sacred transformations are invisible. The soul does not shout, it whispers. And when the ego grows tired enough to listen, grace enters, not with noise but with knowing. You no longer need to be someone. You already are. You no longer need to prove. You've already been chosen. You no longer need to be seen. You see. This is the resurrection no one talks about, the one where the false self dies and the eternal self rises, not to impress, but to rest in the truth. If this spoke to your soul, write in the comments, "I am reborn in silence."